Search her bag immediately. A penniless piece of trash like you definitely stole the diamond brooch. My father-in-law, Jonathan Martin, roared across the grand hall. Dozens of smartphone lenses from the 300 elite guests instantly pointed straight at me. He ruthlessly trampled my dignity in front of the crowd. No family lineage, no stepping stone. You're just a lowly officer clinging to my son to change your life. Empty her bag now. I am Margaret. For 3 years as their daughter-in-law, I had swallowed every bitter pill to hide my true identity. But tonight, forced to dump my personal purse onto the cold marble floor, like a despicable thief, my limit was finally broken. I looked up at the tycoon who was smiling smugly. He had no idea that in exactly 60 seconds, the supreme commander holding the $5.2 billion mega contract would kick open those doors, walk right up to me, and utter 2 words that would bring this arrogant empire crashing down. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. As Thomas Wright inverted my purse in front of the 300 elite guests, a single silver quarter dropped out, bouncing off the cold marble floor with a sharp, echoing ping. My eyes tracked its frantic spinning movement, and in a fraction of a second, the suffocating atmosphere of the grand hall completely faded away. I was violently pulled back to my very first week in this cursed family 3 long years ago. I was standing at strict attention in my father-in-law's sprawling, dimly lit mahogany office. He hadn't even offered me a chair. Instead, he had casually reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out a similar silver coin, and tossed it across his massive desk. It spun exactly like the one on the floor tonight. He leaned back in his leather chair, the amber glow of his desk lamp catching the deep lines of contempt carved into his face. He sneered, his lip curling in utter disgust, and flicked his wrist toward the spinning coin. "A quarter," he said, letting the word hang in the stale air thick with cigar smoke. "That's a highly generous estimation of your entire military pension's worth." He told me I brought absolutely nothing of value to his bloodline, that my presence at his dinner table was an active insult to 3 generations of Martin legacy. I remember locking my knees to prevent myself from swaying, locking my jaw so tight my teeth ached for hours afterward, and staring straight ahead at a point on the wall just above his head. I swallowed the thick, burning bile rising in my throat. I was a fully commissioned Navy lieutenant who led tactical platoons through grueling combat simulations. Yet here I was, systematically stripped of my hard-earned rank and human dignity by a man who had never seen a single day of combat in his pampered life. He reached across the desk, picked up the quarter, and dropped it into his breast pocket as if reclaiming what he considered wasted charity. He thought he had broken me that day, but he had only taught me how to armor my mind. My mother-in-law was no better, utilizing far more insidious passive-aggressive tactics to grind me down over those 3 years. I recalled the endless string of high society dinners where she actively weaponized my physical presence to humiliate me. While the rest of the Martin family toasted with vintage champagne and discussed offshore accounts, she would abruptly snap her manicured fingers in my direction. Pointing at an empty water glass near my elbow, she would command me to fetch a refill from the kitchen, addressing me with the exact same dismissive tone she used on the hired catering staff. At one particular dinner with a senator's wife, Victoria didn't even bother to introduce me by name. She tilted her champagne flute toward me and told the woman, "That's just David's little project. She follows orders well enough." The senator's wife let out a sharp, uncomfortable laugh, her eyes sliding over me with undisguised pity and contempt. I complied every single time, with an entirely blank face, carrying the crystal pitcher back from the kitchen like it was a live grenade I refused to let detonate. Internally, I applied my tactical breathing exercises: 4 seconds in, 4 seconds, hold 4 seconds out to keep my hands from snapping the expensive crystal glass into jagged shards. I calculated every micro-expression on every face at that table, logging each ally and each enemy. I endured the public degradation in absolute silence, refusing to give her the dramatic reaction she desperately craved. I treated those dinners not as family gatherings, but as grueling endurance drills in hostile territory. Each one made me sharper. Each one made me more dangerous. Their favorite and most heavily wielded weapon was their immense corporate wealth. I vividly remember a rainy afternoon about 6 months into the marriage when my father-in-law cornered me in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen and threw a 50-page prenuptial agreement directly at my chest. The heavy leather-bound binder hit my shoulder hard and clattered loudly to the hardwood floor. The sharp crack echoed through the empty corridor. He loomed over me, blocking the only exit, his massive frame filling the doorway. He demanded I sign away any right to his son's sprawling corporate empire, laughing as he explicitly labeled me a penniless gold digger looking for a quick, unearned payout. He said he had lawyers on retainer who specialized in making inconvenient women disappear from family trees. He promised to make my daily life a living hell if I refused to sign, threatening to cut David off entirely just to spite me, to strip his son of his engineering title and throw him into the streets as a warning to anyone else who dared bring common blood into the Martin dynasty. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a tear. I didn't even bother to read a single page of his drafted legal threats. I calmly bent down, picked up his heavy gold-plated fountain pen from where it had rolled against the baseboard, signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes on the back page, and tossed the pen back onto his desk with a loud, defiant clatter. The sound made him flinch. I walked out, leaving him stunned and standing in the empty hallway, but his arrogance remained entirely unchecked. He simply added another bullet to his arsenal, convinced he had cornered me permanently. Through all of this psychological warfare, I never once complained to my husband. I watched from the shadows as my in-laws openly plotted to replace me with a prominent senator's daughter, carelessly leaving glossy brochures for high-end divorce lawyers sitting on my bedroom nightstand, where I would find them every morning. Victoria once left a handwritten note tucked inside one of the brochures that read, "For your consideration, dear." Every insult, every sneer, every deliberate exclusion from holiday dinners and family photographs was a bullet I took straight to the chest. I silently patched the emotional wounds in the dark, pressing my face into the bathroom towel so my husband wouldn't hear the ragged breathing when he came home exhausted from the laboratory. But a soldier can only take so much friendly fire before realizing the people pulling the trigger aren't her allies. They are active combatants. I wasn't just surviving in that house anymore. I was actively gathering intelligence, memorizing the names of their business partners, tracking the dates of suspicious financial transfers, mapping their psychological and financial weaknesses, and quietly waiting for the inevitable day they would push their tyranny one step too far. My only viable escape from the suffocating toxicity of the Martin mansion was the distant naval base. Whenever the gaslighting became too loud to ignore, I drove straight to the outdoor firing range, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the rough leather biting into my palms. The deafening rhythmic cracks of the assault rifles were a profound comfort, effectively drowning out my mother-in-law's shrill, condescending voice, echoing endlessly in my head. I gripped the cold machined steel of my service weapon, feeling the familiar grounding weight of duty and lethal capability settle into my bones. I squeezed the trigger with mechanical precision, center mass, every single time. My range instructor, a grizzled master chief with 30 years of service and 3 combat tours, pulled my target sheet and studied the tight grouping of holes clustered within a 2-inch circle. He nodded once slowly, his way of saying I was still the deadliest shot in the battalion. He pinned the sheet to the wall behind his desk alongside the other top marksmen, and I noticed mine had been up there for 11 consecutive months. The sharp smell of gun oil and spent brass acted as a reset button for my frayed nerves. Here, surrounded by uniformed men and women who bled for their country, who judged me by my accuracy and my leadership and nothing else, I wasn't a nameless, penniless beggar. Here I was, a highly respected officer. Here I commanded authority. The stark contrast between the profound brotherhood of the military and the venomous backstabbing of my marital bloodline only solidified my resolve to outlast them. Sitting alone in the cramped cab of my Jeep after a particularly brutal range session, the engine ticking as it cooled, I pulled out a heavy, secure satellite phone and dialed a highly encrypted, untraceable number. My dad answered on the second ring, his deep voice an anchor in the storm. I didn't cry, but my throat was tight, and my voice strained as I reported the latest humiliation, a fabricated accusation involving the fake theft of a pearl necklace that Victoria had planted in my coat pocket, and then screamed about at dinner. My dad listened in complete silence, absorbing every detail the way he absorbed battlefield intelligence. He didn't offer empty pity or soft consolations. He treated me like the soldier I was. He gave me a tactical command. True power never needs to scream for attention. He said, his tone absolute and unwavering, the voice of a man who had commanded aircraft carriers through hostile waters. The greatest, most devastating victories are always won by those who have the discipline to hold their fire the longest. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, absorbing his ironclad strength through the phone like it was a direct blood transfusion. I repeated the words silently 3 times, branding them into my operational memory. Returning to the sprawling mansion always felt like walking unprotected into an active ambush zone. Before stepping onto the property, I would systematically change out of my pristine Navy uniform in the detached, dusty garage, the bare bulb swinging overhead casting long shadows across the oil-stained concrete. I carefully unpinned my newly awarded commendation medals one by one, running my thumb over the engraved surface of each before placing them in a locked steel lockbox, hidden securely beneath the loose floorboards. I absolutely refused to let my in-laws' filthy, money-obsessed hands taint the uniform I bled for. The lockbox also held my official service records, my promotion letters, and a single photograph of my dad in full dress uniform, the photograph I touched every night before closing the lid. I walked through the cramped service entrance, completely ignoring the grand front doors, my footsteps silent on the concrete ramp where the catering trucks unloaded. My posture was rigid, my facial muscles locked. I adjusted my simple civilian clothes like I was strapping on a Kevlar vest, mentally preparing myself for another grueling night of psychological warfare at the dinner table. I knew with absolute certainty that the Martin Empire was rotting from the inside out. I didn't need to be a Wall Street financial genius to see it. I just read the heavily redacted quarterly reports my father-in-law carelessly left scattered around his unlocked study, the pages covered in red ink and frantic margin notes in his cramped handwriting. I memorized the numbers. Revenue down 38%. Outstanding debt exceeding $400 million. 3 major government contracts lost in the previous fiscal year due to cost overruns and faulty quality control. They were drowning in massive, unmanageable debt, desperately hoping for a miraculous military bailout to stay afloat. I watched them parade their fake, glittering wealth at charity galas, knowing exactly who held the key to their corporate survival. My father. The man they had never bothered to identify. The man whose daughter they treated like garbage. I didn't need to fight them with screaming matches or petty arguments. I just had to wait for the perfect moment for their arrogance to destroy them. And that moment was coming faster than any of them could calculate. My husband David was my absolute only source of oxygen in that suffocating house. I remember the countless nights he would physically pull me away from the toxic dinner table, his hand warm and solid around my wrist, leading me up the fire escape to the mansion's roof, just to watch the city lights in peaceful silence. Those stolen hours on the cold concrete ledge, our legs dangling over the edge, were the only moments in 3 years where I could exhale completely. He hated his father's empire of lies just as much as I did. He was a brilliant weapons engineer, a man who built defensive systems that protected lives, but his father treated him like a disposable pawn on a corporate chessboard. I once watched my father-in-law slam David's blueprints onto the boardroom table during a quarterly review and call his entire division, an expensive science fair project that a community college dropout could manage, in front of 12 senior executives and 2 Pentagon liaisons. David's jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed visibly at his temple, but he said nothing. He simply gathered his papers, straightened them against the table edge with precise measured taps, and walked out. We bonded over our shared captivity, finding genuine peace only when we were alone, away from the glaring chandeliers and the endless lectures about legacy and profit margins. We were 2 prisoners planning an escape that neither of us could execute alone. He fought for me in his own quiet, desperate ways. I remember a Tuesday when my mother-in-law deliberately threw away my favorite pair of worn-out running boots, the ones I had broken in over 4 years of pre-dawn training runs on the base, spitefully claiming they ruined the high-end aesthetic of the mudroom. She had stuffed them into the garbage compactor and run the cycle before I returned from the base, crushing them into a flat, unrecognizable mass. David didn't argue with her. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he drove 3 hours in the pouring, freezing rain to a specialty sporting goods store in another state to buy the exact same pair, the exact same size, the exact same color. He left them on my side of the bed without a note. He was my shield, absorbing his father's vicious verbal wrath whenever he could intercept it, placing his body between the tyrant and me at every dinner, every meeting, every staged family event. I endured the daily humiliation specifically to protect him, knowing that if I fought back prematurely and blew my cover, his father would instantly strip him of his life's work and throw him onto the street with nothing but the clothes on his back. Then came the mandatory summons to the Martin Defense 35th Anniversary Gala. It was the ultimate trap, a high-stakes performance for the defense industry elite military brass and Washington power brokers. We both knew the company was bleeding cash at an alarming rate and desperately needed the Navy's $5.2 billion contract to survive the fiscal year. Without that contract, Martin Defense would default on its loans within 90 days. The entire empire, 35 years of Jonathan's legacy, hinged on a single signature from the Supreme Commander of the Naval Fleet. My husband was terrified. For a week he paced our bedroom late into the night, running his hands nervously through his hair, wearing a track into the carpet between the window and the closet door. He was deeply afraid of what his father might do under such extreme financial pressure. He knew Jonathan would lash out at the easiest target to assert dominance, and that target was always me. He begged me not to attend. I told him that was not an option. As I dressed for the gala, I completely bypassed the flashy sequined gowns my mother-in-law had sent to my room as a passive-aggressive suggestion, 3 of them, each one more gaudy and revealing than the last, hanging on the closet door with a typed note that read, "Appropriate attire for a Martin event." Instead, I deliberately chose a simple dark gray unadorned dress. No diamonds, no silk, no pretension whatsoever. I laced up my practical low-heeled shoes with precise, methodical movements, feeling the familiar tension in my muscles like I was preparing for a combat drop behind enemy lines. I pulled my hair back into a tight regulation bun, the same way I wore it under my service cover on base. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were flat, cold, and entirely emotionless. The time for hiding was rapidly coming to an end. Tonight was the night the waiting would end. I reached under the floorboards in the garage one last time, touched the photograph of my dad, and walked to the car. We stepped through the towering double doors into the sprawling main hall, instantly greeted by the blinding, almost aggressive flash of a dozen massive crystal chandeliers. The air inside the room was heavy, thick with the smell of old money, expensive imported perfume, and a palpable, undeniable undercurrent of corporate desperation. High-ranking politicians, lobbyists, and retired generals clustered nervously in tight corners, sipping premium scotch and whispering frantically about the company's impending bankruptcy if the Supreme Admiral didn't arrive to sign the contract. I caught fragments of their panicked conversations as I passed phrases like, "total collapse by Q3, and "this is the last lifeline," and "if the Admiral walks, we're all finished," floating through the thick cigar smoke like distress signals. A cluster of junior executives near the bar argued in hushed, rapid voices about whether to update their resumes before Monday. The desperation in the room smelled sharper than the perfume. I stood tall near the entrance, my spine locked in perfect, unyielding military posture, cataloging every face, every exit, every nervous glance exchanged between the power brokers. A young waiter, visibly overwhelmed by the hostile crowd and barely old enough to shave, stumbled near me, his elbow catching the edge of a marble column. With pure, drilled reflex, my hand shot out, catching the heavy silver tray of champagne flutes before a single drop spilled onto the floor. The tray was heavier than it looked. I stabilized it with one hand and guided it back into his trembling grip. I smiled gently at the terrified boy, nodding once to reassure him, completely indifferent to the fake luxury and the predatory stares of the elite surrounding me. My husband pushed his way through the dense, suffocating crowd of executives, finding me near a massive, heavily carved stone pillar. His face was drawn, the skin tight around his eyes, the look of a man who hadn't slept properly in a week. He grabbed my hand, squeezing it so hard his knuckles turned white. I could feel the cold beads of sweat on his palm, the slight tremor running through his fingers. "Be careful," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously across the room toward the roaring fireplace where his father currently held court among a group of defense contractors gesticulating wildly with a scotch glass in one hand and a lit cigar in the other. "My father is under extreme pressure. Just stay close to me." I looked at his deeply stressed face, reading the exhaustion and fear etched into his features, like a topographic map of 3 decades of abuse. I gave his trembling hand a firm, reassuring squeeze, ensuring my own expression remained a completely unreadable stoic mask. "I'm fine, just focus on your work," I replied evenly, taking a slow, measured sip of cold mineral water from my glass. My encrypted phone sat in my dress pocket, set to vibrate. I was waiting for a single message. I was prepared for everything that was about to happen. The only person in this room who wasn't afraid was me. My mother-in-law materialized through the dense crowd like a shark sensing blood in open water. She glided toward us in a custom glittering silk gown that undoubtedly cost more than a junior enlisted soldier's entire yearly salary, her diamond earrings throwing tiny, fractured rainbows across the marble as she moved. Her eyes locked onto my simple, unadorned dark gray dress, and her pupils dilated with pure, unadulterated malice. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough for me to smell the sickly sweet cloud of her imported French perfume, raising her voice loudly enough for a dozen high-ranking executives and politicians to hear every word clearly. "A classless outfit reeking of a lowly grunt. How brave of you to wear that to an event like this," she hissed through her teeth, a cruel, mocking smile plastered on her face. She made a deliberate show of looking me up and down head to toe, then turning to the cluster of executives beside her and shaking her head in theatrical disappointment. Two of them, a retired general and a lobbyist with a spray tan, chuckled on cue like trained dogs. She turned on her heel and glided away, leaving a toxic trail of snickering and sycophantic laughter from the elite guests who were desperate to stay in her good graces. But the public humiliation hung in the air thick and acrid. My husband's jaw clenched so hard I genuinely thought his teeth would shatter under the pressure. The veins in his neck bulged, his fists tightened into heavy weapons at his sides, and he took a sudden aggressive step forward, fully ready to chase after his mother and explode in front of the entire assembly. I quickly reached out and grabbed his arm, my grip locking onto his bicep like a cold steel vise, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Don't." I gently stopped him, my voice completely level but carrying the absolute authority of a commanding officer. "Not now. Tonight is too important." He exhaled through his nose, a hard, sharp breath, but his muscles unclenched under my grip. He trusted me. He always trusted me. I smoothly pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket, glancing down at the illuminated screen. A single short text message from my dad glowed brightly against the dark background. 2 words. "In position." My shoulders instantly relaxed, a profound sense of calm washing over me, the kind of calm that only comes when you know the entire battlefield has already been mapped and every piece is exactly where it needs to be. I looked up just as the live classical music abruptly died. The symphony stopped mid-note, the violinist's bow suspended in the air. From across the room, I saw my father-in-law marching aggressively through the parted crowd, his furious eyes locked dead on me, his cigar trailing smoke behind him like the exhaust of an incoming missile. The heavy, oppressive silence in the grand hall was violently shattered by my father-in-law's booming, alcohol-laced voice. "You there, I want to talk." He pointed the glowing cherry of his expensive cigar directly at my face, pulling every single eye in the massive room toward us like a spotlight operator at a public execution. Hundreds of conversations died instantly. Crystal glasses froze halfway to painted lips. I didn't flinch. I calmly placed my water glass on a passing waiter's tray, with a soft, deliberate click squared my shoulders to perfectly align my spine, and faced him with absolute statuesque stillness. "Yes, Mr. Martin." He closed the distance between us in 4 aggressive strides, slamming his heavy fist down on a nearby cocktail table so hard that a champagne flute toppled over and shattered against the marble, the sharp crack making a woman nearby gasp. "Don't call me Mr. Martin, as if we are equals." He growled, his face twisted in a snarl of pure contempt, the veins in his forehead pulsing visibly beneath the chandelier light. "You've been in my family for 3 years, and during all that time I only see a lowly officer. I had someone investigate your entire military background, and do you know what I found? A big fat 0. No stepping stone, no family backing you up. Just a leech clinging to my son to change your life." He jabbed his cigar toward the crowd, as if presenting evidence to a jury, his other hand gripping the edge of the cocktail table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He paced back and forth like a rabid dog on a leash, playing directly to the crowd of 300 elites visibly basking in his own perceived dominance and the fear he instilled in others. His polished shoes clicked on the marble in a frantic, irregular rhythm that matched his unraveling composure. I didn't break eye contact for a millisecond. I stared straight into his bloodshot, furious eyes, watching the capillaries pulse in the whites. "I have never hidden my identity, sir," I replied, my voice dead calm flat, as a rifle bore flatly refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break or beg. My hands remained at my sides, fingers loose, shoulders square. "How convenient," he yelled, spreading his arms wide to address the gathered guests, as if performing a theatrical monologue on a Broadway stage. "Let me tell everyone what I see tonight. I see a nameless, penniless girl with a meager salary daring to climb high and marry the heir of one of the largest defense contractors. I see a person looking at my son and seeing nothing but a gold mine." He turned back to me, closing the distance until the stench of single malt scotch on his breath burned my nostrils. I took half a step forward, invading his personal space further, forcing him to recalibrate. I delivered my strike with icy surgical precision, my voice carrying just far enough for the front 3 rows of spectators to hear every syllable. "Your intelligence team's information gathering is utterly incompetent. You should reconsider your sources." The sheer audacity of a subordinate actively challenging his intelligence caused his face to twist into a mask of pure, unhinged purple rage. A dangerous vein throbbed at his left temple. He spun violently toward his terrified CFO Richard Evans, who had been trying to make himself invisible behind a marble column, and screamed at the top of his lungs like a cornered dictator ordering a firing squad. "Richard, tomorrow morning I want my son stripped of all his titles as chief design engineer. Freeze all his bank accounts, revoke all privileges. Today he is the future of Martin Defense. Tomorrow he is nothing. Not a single penny to his name." The CFO flinched so hard his champagne sloshed over the rim of his glass and splashed onto his shoes. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, too terrified to speak, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Jonathan then cornered my husband, jabbing a thick, aggressive finger hard into David's chest, pushing him backward with each stab. "You have exactly one choice: the position of heir to this weapons empire or your grunt wife. If you choose that woman, you are no longer a Martin. You will be out on the street empty-handed, throwing away the entire 35-year legacy I painstakingly built." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the raw desperation beneath the manufactured fury. The entire hall completely stopped breathing. 300 bodies stood frozen in a tableau of morbid anticipation. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums, like the cabin compression before a high-altitude drop. I looked up at my husband, my heart swelling with a fierce, profound pride that eclipsed any anger I felt toward his father. David's hands were shaking, but his eyes were clear. I leaned in slightly, my voice steady and completely sincere, pitched just for him, but audible enough that the nearest guests caught every word. "Whatever you decide, I will always respect you." David didn't even hesitate for a microsecond. He didn't look at the CFO. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't glance at the gold-framed portraits of Martin patriarchs lining the walls. He stepped firmly in front of me, physically shielding my body from the tyrant's wrath, his shoulder blades forming a wall between his father's rage and my body. He looked his father dead in the bloodshot eyes, his voice ringing with absolute clarity and the kind of conviction that only comes from a man who has finally decided to stop being afraid. "I choose her. I am willing to throw away all the wealth, all the shares of this family. I will always choose her." Jonathan's neck veins bulged dangerously, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he realized he had lost his ultimate leverage, the only card he had ever played against his son. The champagne glass in his free hand cracked under the pressure of his grip. "Then get out, both of you, get out of my sight!" He roared, his voice cracking with fury, spittle flying from his lips and catching the chandelier light. David and I turned our backs on the tyrant without another word, walking side by side toward the towering grand windows to wait for our car in the darkness. My husband's hand found mine, his grip steadier, now warmer. We were inches from freedom when suddenly a highly theatrical piercing scream ripped through the hall, instantly freezing every single person in place. My mother-in-law clutched her bare, heavily powdered collar, her face contorted in a mask of wildly exaggerated fake panic. My brooch. Where is my heirloom diamond brooch? It was just right here. She whipped around her eyes, scanning the crowd with practiced predatory precision, before locking onto me with rehearsed accuracy. Her red-painted fingernail pointed directly at my face like a loaded weapon. She was standing right next to me 10 minutes ago. This penniless beggar took it. This thief took advantage of the chaos to steal my property. The murmur of the crowd instantly transformed into vicious accusatory whispers that spread through the room like wildfire. I could hear the words, "thief," and "arrest her," rippling outward from the epicenter of Victoria's performance. My father-in-law's eyes lit up with a sick, sadistic joy, the kind of light that flickers in the eyes of a man who has just been thrown a lifeline while drowning. He had lost the battle for his son, but he suddenly realized he had the perfect manufactured excuse to destroy me legally and publicly. He aggressively summoned Thomas Wright, the head of the mansion's private security detail, snapping his thick fingers twice as if calling a dog. Thomas, a hardened former mercenary who stood 6'3" and weighed 240 pounds, who actually understood the law far better than the billionaire paying his salary, hesitated. He visibly sweated, his hand hovering near his earpiece, his jaw tight, as he realized the severe legal implications of detaining a citizen without cause at a private event in front of 300 witnesses with active smartphones. "Search her right now," Jonathan barked. Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Sir, we don't have a search warrant," he cautioned softly, his eyes flicking toward the crowd of recording phones. Jonathan shoved a heavy cocktail chair aside so violently it skidded 3 feet across the marble and crashed into a waiter's station, shattering a tray of crystal glasses. Spittle flew from his mouth as his rage reached a boiling point. "I don't care about the rules. This is my house. Search her bag immediately." My husband lunged forward, his fists raised, fully ready to physically fight the armed guards to protect my honor. The veins in his arms stood out like cables. I immediately grabbed his wrist, locking his arm down against his side with practiced military precision, my thumb pressing into the pressure point on the inside of his forearm. "Not yet, wait," I whispered, my tone absolute, the exact command voice I used on the bridge during combat drills. He stopped. He trusted me. I stepped forward voluntarily into the center of the hostile circle, the crowd parting around me like I was radioactive. I held out my small, inexpensive purse, a simple black clutch that cost $12 at a department store. I let Thomas invert it with one massive hand. My phone, a cheap tube of lipstick, my military ID, and a few loose dollars spilled out, clattering loudly against the cold marble floor in the deafening silence. Dozens of smartphone cameras flashed brightly, eagerly trying to capture my ultimate humiliation. But the crowd gasped in profound, embarrassed disappointment. The bag was completely empty. There was no diamond, not a single piece of jewelry, nothing but the bare essentials of a woman who had never needed anyone else's wealth. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, and my voice echoed off the marble walls like a sharp gunshot, cutting through the murmurs and silencing every whisper in the vast hall. "Madam, your diamond brooch is resting on the wine tray near the fireplace over there. You took it off when you complained about it scratching the silk on your collar. I observed that action an hour ago." Every head in the crowd turned in perfect unison, 300 necks, rotating like synchronized machinery, instantly spotting the sparkling jewel sitting exactly where I said it was, its facets catching the firelight and throwing tiny rainbows across the stone mantelpiece. Victoria's manufactured accusation collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane, illuminating her blatant lie for every single person with a camera phone. Jonathan, his face now a dangerous shade of purple, his carefully constructed public humiliation of me in smoking ruins marched up until he was inches from my face. His breath reeked heavily of scotch. His pupils dilated to black pinpoints, utterly humiliated, but stubbornly, pathologically unyielding. "You think you've won? I will use every connection I have at the Pentagon. I will force the military to strip your rank, kick you out of the force permanently. You will live the rest of your life scurrying like a rat." His voice was raw, cracking the voice of a man who could feel the ground crumbling beneath his feet but refused to stop digging. I didn't blink. I stared him down, my eyes lethal and cold, the eyes of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. Mr. Jonathan, you have chosen the wrong person to threaten. The exact moment my lethal warning left my lips, a massive thunderous thud echoed from the main entrance of the grand hall. The heavy, solid oak double doors were shoved violently open by unseen hands, slamming against the marble walls with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead and sent a visible tremor through the champagne flutes on every table. A chilling, powerful gust of night air swept into the oppressively warm hall like a living thing, instantly blowing out the dozens of decorative candles lining the center aisles and plunging entire sections of the room into sudden, sharp shadow. The sudden shift in temperature and atmosphere from the stifling heat of 300 anxious bodies to the raw, biting cold of the night caused all 300 elite guests to turn in perfect unison toward the entrance, their collective movement producing a single soft rustle of expensive fabric. A single older man walked in through the gaping doorway. He wore no expensive tuxedo, displayed no sparkling medals on his chest, and carried no massive, intimidating security detail flanking his shoulders. He was draped only in a faded olive-green military trench coat, the thick fabric visibly worn at the edges from years of brutal deployment, the brass buttons tarnished to a dull gold that spoke of decades of active service. A thin line of rain darkened the shoulders of the coat, but every single step his heavy combat boots took on the polished marble floor hit like a war drum, the sound rhythmic and deliberate and absolutely terrifying in the dead silence of the room. He walked with the suffocating aura of a king who ruled over active battlefields, a man who had personally signed orders that moved aircraft carriers across oceans, a man holding the absolute power of life and death in his bare, calloused hands. The crowd parted instinctively, backing away, as if repelled by a magnetic force, expensive shoes scuffing against the marble as bodies pressed against walls and columns. He scanned the room with a single sweeping gaze that catalogued every face, every weapon, every exit. The assessment of a man who had walked into hostile territory more times than anyone in this room had attended cocktail parties. Then his eyes found me standing strong and defiant amidst the pack of corporate wolves, and he offered a faint, nearly imperceptible smile of deep paternal pride. I uncrossed my arms, relaxed my shoulders, and simply watched the execution unfold. My mother-in-law, however, was completely blinded by her lifelong snobbery and still furious at being proven wrong about her stolen diamond brooch. The humiliation of her fabricated theft accusation collapsing in public had twisted her face into a mask of barely contained hysteria. She desperately needed a target to vent her escalating rage and reassert her dominance over the room, to remind everyone who owned this party and who set the rules. Seeing an older man in a faded, unbranded coat dare to enter her prestigious invite-only gala through the main doors, the VIP entrance reserved exclusively for billionaires and senators and defense industry royalty, she lost her mind. Every ounce of her carefully maintained composure evaporated in an instant. She marched right into his path, her high heels clicking aggressively against the stone, like the cocking of a small-caliber weapon physically blocking him from advancing. She planted herself directly in front of him, her diamond earrings swinging, her chin jutted upward at a man who stood a full head taller than her. "The employee entrance is in the back. You are not allowed through the VIP doors," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she lost all semblance of high society control, the veneer of elegance stripped away to reveal the petty, vicious tyrant beneath. As she yelled the insult, she wildly threw her arm forward in a gesture of pure, dismissive rage, the kind of gesture she had used 1,000 times to wave away servants and subordinates. The half-full glass of dark red wine in her hand sloshed violently, and the liquid flew through the air in a slow, terrible arc. It splashed directly onto the chest of his olive-green military coat. The dark red liquid splattered across the worn fabric like a burst of arterial spray, soaking in instantly and looking exactly like fresh dripping blood against the faded green. The collective gasp from the 300 guests sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the massive hall. The sound was a single unified inhale of pure, horrified disbelief. The entire hall froze in a state of absolute paralyzed horror. The live symphony music, which had just started to softly play again in a desperate attempt to restore normalcy, stopped entirely with a harsh, ugly scrape of a cello bow, dragging across a string. 300 people completely stopped breathing. The silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the adjacent hallway. The older man didn't flinch. He didn't shout for security. He didn't raise his hand to strike her. He didn't step back or show any sign of surprise whatsoever. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of discipline forged in war and tempered by decades of command over the most powerful naval force on Earth. He slowly looked down at the blood-red wine stain soaking into his combat coat, observing it with clinical detachment the way a surgeon observes an incision. His eyes traced the spreading pattern of the stain with an almost scientific curiosity. Then he raised his eyes, staring directly at my mother-in-law, with the crushing, silent, terrifying depth of an ocean trench. The weight of that gaze was physical. Victoria's knees buckled slightly under it, her stilettos wobbling on the marble. He didn't show a shred of anger. Instead, he offered a cold, completely emotionless smile that sent violent shivers down the spine of every single person watching, the smile of a man who had just received exactly the evidence he needed to complete an operation. "Thank you, madam. This action is very helpful for my decision," he stated, his voice a low rumbling baritone that carried easily across the dead silent room, without any effort, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime issuing commands that were obeyed without question across every ocean on the planet. The sheer contrast between his absolute chilling composure and her hysterical shallow stupidity was deafening. Victoria took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water, the color draining rapidly from her face as she suddenly realized she had just made a catastrophic error, far beyond anything her limited imagination could have prepared her for, even if she didn't yet know exactly who she had assaulted. From the back of the crowd, Richard Evans, the CFO of Martin Defense, pushed his way forward through the frozen bodies of the elite guests. He had been staring at the man in the green coat from across the room, his eyes growing progressively wider with each step the older man had taken, his champagne-holding hand trembling so violently that the golden liquid sloshed in the crystal. His accountant's mind, trained to recognize the faces and names of every person who held power over the company's survival, had been running facial recognition against every military briefing photograph he had ever studied. As the man spoke, his deep baritone unmistakable, the CFO's face underwent a transformation so violent it looked like a special effect. His jaw dropped. His eyes bulged. He dropped his crystal champagne glass. It shattered violently against the marble, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silence, sending shards of crystal skittering across the polished floor in every direction. His face drained of all blood, turning a sickly, translucent ash white, as he stumbled backward, pointing a violently trembling finger at the older man, his arm shaking so badly it looked like he was having a seizure. "Admiral Arthur Jones, Supreme Commander of the Naval Fleet. You are the one deciding the $5.2 billion contract tonight." The name dropped like a tactical nuclear weapon in the center of the hall. The shockwave was palpable, physical, a visible ripple of realization that spread outward from Richard through the crowd, like the blast wave of a detonation. Mouths fell open. Glasses slipped from numb fingers. Jonathan Martin physically froze, his entire body locking up as if every muscle had been injected with concrete. His knees buckled slightly, his eyes bulging in absolute terror as the full catastrophic magnitude of his wife's actions detonated in his brain. My father completely ignored the gasps, the whispers, and the rising panic of the elite crowd. He swept his highly authoritative gaze across the room in a slow, deliberate arc, making absolutely sure every CEO, every politician, every retired general, and every smartphone camera was watching. The room was a courtroom, and he was the judge. Then he pointed squarely at me, his arm extending with the precision and finality of a man aiming a weapon. His voice boomed with absolute, unquestionable authority, filling every corner of the cavernous hall. "Margaret, the female officer you just called trash, just framed as a thief, is my biological daughter." The shockwave of the revelation hit my father-in-law so hard, he physically stumbled backward, crashing heavily into a terrified waiter holding a tray of appetizers. The tray went down with a tremendous clatter, shrimp and caviar scattering across the marble like debris from an explosion. Without waiting for a single apology or explanation from the man who had just publicly tortured his daughter, my father reached into the inner pocket of his stained coat with a slow, deliberate motion that the entire room tracked, with terrified, unblinking eyes. He pulled out a thick, black, military-encrypted satellite phone, a device that looked like it had been carried through sandstorms and monsoons, its rubberized case scarred and worn. He punched in a short speed dial sequence with his thumb, each press of his calloused fingertip producing a clear electronic beep. The silence in the massive room was so profound, so utterly absolute, that you could hear each individual beep echoing off the marble walls and bouncing back from the vaulted ceiling. 300 people held their breath. He put the phone to his ear. "It's me." His voice was absolute ice, cutting through the room with the force of a scythe. He paused for exactly 1 second, letting the words settle over the crowd. "The bidding file for Martin Defense's next-generation weapon system. Cancel it entirely. Immediately." He didn't wait for a confirmation on the other end. He simply severed the connection with a single press of his thumb and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face an impenetrable mask of military execution. The entire call had lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, he had erased 35 years of corporate legacy. Those short-clipped words were an instant, irreversible death sentence for the entire Martin Defense Corporation. Every person in that room who understood the defense industry, which was every person in that room, knew exactly what had just happened. Jonathan snapped out of his stunned paralysis as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down on him like a collapsing building. He lunged forward, pushing past his frozen wife with such force that she stumbled sideways into a marble column. His face was pale as wax, sweat pouring down his forehead in visible streams, darkening the collar of his bespoke shirt. His half-smoked cigar had fallen to the floor long ago. He held his hands out in a pathetic, shaking, begging gesture, his fingers splayed wide, the hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts now trembling like leaves in a gale. He clawed desperately at his silk tie, yanking it loose as if it were a noose tightening around his neck. "You can't do this. Thousands of people. 35 years of my life's work." He was literally whining, his voice high-pitched and frantic, completely stripped of all his arrogant, untouchable armor. Tears cut through the sweat on his face. The man who had sneered at my military pension, who had tossed a quarter across his desk to represent my worth, who had demanded I be searched like a common street thief just moments before, was now begging for mercy from the man whose daughter he had relentlessly tried to destroy for 3 long years. Beads of sweat dripped from his chin, splattering onto the cold marble beneath him, each tiny impact audible in the devastating silence. The crowd watched in morbid fascination as the mighty titan of the defense industry crumbled into a weeping, gasping shell of a man. My father didn't step back, nor did he show a single ounce of pity. He looked down at the pathetic, sweating tycoon with absolute, unyielding disgust, the same expression I had seen him wear when inspecting a failed system that had put sailors' lives at risk. "You should have thought of that before you searched my daughter like a criminal." He fired back, his voice echoing like thunder through the cavernous hall, each word landing with the weight and finality of a judge's gavel. I knew exactly what my role was in this final act. I had rehearsed it in my mind every night for 3 years, lying in the dark of that suffocating mansion staring at the ceiling. I stepped up, leaving David's side for a brief moment to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father. I squared my shoulders, feeling the familiar alignment of my spine snapping into perfect military posture. I snapped the heels of my boots together with a sharp crack that echoed through the room like a rifle report. I stood at perfect, rigid attention, my chin level, my eyes forward, my body a living instrument of military discipline. I raised my hand in a crisp, flawless military salute, acknowledging my superior officer and the man who had taught me how to survive this war. "Good evening, Admiral." "Hi, Dad." That crisp, undeniable salute was the final nail in the coffin, the visual exclamation point at the end of a 3-year sentence. It cemented the unbreakable bond between the Supreme Commander of the Naval Fleet and the woman they had treated as trash, as a gold digger, as a penniless leech, unworthy of their precious bloodline. Jonathan's knees completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the cold marble floor, the thud echoing through the room like a body hitting the deck of a ship. His hands flew up to clutch his head as he gasped for air, hyperventilating in the face of his total annihilation, his chest heaving in short, ragged bursts. His perfectly tailored jacket splayed open on the marble, his silk pocket square tumbling out and lying crumpled beside his shaking body. Beside him, Victoria stood frozen like a grotesque statue, her jaw hanging open, staring at her empty, wine-stained hands in absolute horror, finally realizing with the full crushing force of reality that she had just thrown her drink on the one man on earth who held the power to save them from bankruptcy. The dark red wine still stained her trembling fingers. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat over their broken bodies. I didn't say another word. I dropped my salute with precise mechanical formality, turned smoothly on my heel, took my husband's hand once more, and walked out the towering front doors into the cool night air. Our footsteps in perfect rhythm, leaving the burning empire and the 300 silent witnesses far behind us. The next morning, the financial world exploded with unprecedented violence. I woke at 5:30 the way I always did, my internal clock set by a decade of military discipline. I made a pot of strong black coffee in the small kitchen of our rented apartment, the cheap machine gurgling and hissing on the laminate counter. The first sip was bitter and perfect. I sat at the small table by the window watching the pale light spread across the city skyline and picked up my phone. A secretly recorded cell phone video of the illegal search, the vicious insults, and the catastrophic wine-throwing incident had flooded every major news network and social media platform before sunrise. The video had already been viewed 47 million times. My phone buzzed constantly, the vibrations so frequent the device actually moved across the table surface by itself. Wall Street panicked immediately. Martin Defense stock plummeted at the opening bell, triggering automatic trading halts as billions of dollars in market capitalization were wiped out in a matter of minutes. Every financial headline screamed the same story. As promised, the Department of Defense officially blacklisted the corporation from all future bidding, citing severe ethical violations and lack of reliable leadership. I turned the phone face down on the table, took another long sip of coffee, and watched a bird land on the fire, escape outside the window. The board of directors convened a frantic emergency meeting before noon the same day. Desperate to save themselves from the military's unyielding wrath and mitigate the catastrophic public relations disaster, Elizabeth Hughes ruthlessly ousted Jonathan in a vote that lasted less than 4 minutes. They stripped him of his CEO title, revoked his board seat, and seized all his executive power. In a deeply ironic twist of fate, he was physically escorted out of his own towering glass building by the exact same security guards he had commanded to illegally search my purse just 12 hours earlier. Thomas Wright himself held the door open as Jonathan was walked to the curb. David sat beside me on our second-hand couch and watched the footage on his laptop, the shaky cell phone video of his father being guided out of the revolving glass doors flanked by 2 guards carrying a single cardboard box. David didn't say a word. He simply closed the laptop screen and placed his warm hand over mine. I didn't stop at their financial ruin. I filed a massive, highly publicized civil suit against Jonathan and Victoria for unlawful detainment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. Thomas Wright, the security chief, chose to protect his own future and testified entirely on my behalf, detailing years of their abusive behavior, the fake theft accusations, the illegal searches, the systematic humiliation of staff and family members alike. His testimony ran for 6 hours and filled 93 pages of court transcript. Facing total destruction in court and advised by their own attorneys that they had zero chance of prevailing, my former in-laws were forced to settle for an undisclosed sum and issue a humiliating, groveling public apology that was broadcast on 3 major networks. Through it all, I rejected every single media interview request. I turned down 4 book deals and 2 documentary offers. I maintained the spotless discipline and quiet dignity of my military uniform. The uniform they had mocked, the uniform that had won the war. With his inheritance gone but his soul finally free, my husband David built his own highly successful civil engineering firm, from scratch designing bridges and water treatment systems for communities that needed them, entirely free of his father's toxic, looming shadow. He hired 3 of his former colleagues who had been laid off in the Martin Defense collapse, giving them the same chance at a clean start that we had fought for ourselves. Jonathan Martin lost absolutely everything he held dear. His company, his son, his wealth, and his dignity stripped away one by one like the medals he never earned. He eventually died alone, deeply isolated in a small apartment on the far side of the city, his name a cautionary tale whispered at industry conferences and taught in business ethics courses. He learned the hard way that true power doesn't come from shouting orders, wearing diamonds, or hoarding bank accounts. It comes from disciplined character and an unbreakable inner calm. The most dangerous person in the room is never the one screaming for attention. It is always the quietest one holding their fire. True power doesn't need to scream to be heard. If my journey brought you a sense of justice, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share how you've overcome toxic manipulation in your own life in the comments below.